of us right here know it, and everyone watching, if they're honest, knows it too. That it's acceptable to use violence and intimidation against right-wingers. Imagine that Trump comes out tomorrow and says, Antifa's killed people, and anyone that denies it goes to jail. That's hate speech. That's denial of atrocity.
He's already trying to do that.
Where did he do that? Show me.
The fucking national security mandate that came out not too long ago, where he basically made it to where being anti-capitalist, being anti-Christian, etc., and is considered, will get you thrown on the fucking terrorism watch list.
I don't believe that.
Did you not see that?
I don't believe that's the case. I do not believe that's the case.
I will find it and DM it to you.
I will happily read it, but I do not believe that's the case. I am aware of there's been things that would be seen as an infringement on free speech. Not all of it, I agree, from the Trump administration, but it has more to do with guests of the United States. So, for example, you're here on a student visa. Now, that's different. I have free speech rights that my government shouldn't enforce upon me. However, if I'm a guest somewhere, I understand as a guest being asked to leave because I'm not abiding by the rules of the host. If I come into your house and you say, please no cursing, and I continue to curse, I would expect you to ask me to leave. If you're a guest of this country and we ask you things like, please don't burn the American flag and shout death to America, even though as a U.S. citizen I should have that right, I'm under no obligation to say that our country should keep you here as a guest if you're saying those things. So the level of sort of protection that you have from the government intervention here is different depending on your citizenship status. But the idea that Trump, I will think that it's absolutely absurd to think that you're going to show me something that says that you could go to jail if you're anti-capitalist. I just don't believe that's the case. I guess I'd be shocked if it's true. I'll happily look at it. I don't see anywhere in this, by looking through it, where it suggests that if you're anti-capitalist, you go to jail. I mean, what I see is it's outlining what they see. This is from September. It's outlining what they see as sort of political violence, and it's specifically talking about domestic, and some of the things it says of the people they've seen of political violence coalesced around messages such as ones that were, anti-Semitic or anti-capitalist, etc. That doesn't mean that it's saying everyone who's anti-capitalist is a terrorist. It's defining the actual acts of political violence that they've seen and describing what they've coalesced around.
Well, it's saying those are indicators, now considered indicators for the terrorism watch list. So
it says there are common recurrent motivations and indicia uniting this pattern of violence and terrorist activities under the umbrella of self-described anti-fascism. These movements portray foundational American principles, support for law enforcement and border control, as fascist to justify and encourage acts of violent retribution. This anti-fascist lie has become an organizing rallying cry by domestic terrorists to wage a violent assault against democratic institutions. They are fundamental American liberties. Common threads in animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility to those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. It's not saying that everyone that holds any of those views is a terrorist. It's talking specifically about basically Antifa and what their coalescing principles are, what we could expect to see from them. But what it's talking about is infiltrating and taking down domestic terrorist organizations like Antifa, and here are some of the common themes that they have. That's not saying everyone who's anti. I think you're completely, if you're not Antifa, I think you're completely fine saying, I don't like capitalism, and no government agency is going to break down your door.
The problem with that is Antifa is not a organized group with a hierarchy.
We disagree.
It is an ideology.
Disagree.
But
I can show you the websites. You want to see John Brown Gun Club, Rose City Antifa, right?
I mean, there are small sects that are organized, but like the movement as a whole is not an organization.
Is the mafia an organization?
Yes.
Show me. What's their hierarchy? Who's the head of the mafia?
I mean, it depends on the mafia you're talking about. And
what do you mean? If there is a mafia, what do you mean? Which one am I talking about? There is a mafia. That's what you said. The truth is, I'll answer it for you. Yes, clearly the mafia exists. However, the mafia's argument was, we don't exist. There's no organization called the mafia. There's La Costa Nostra. There is the Gambino family, right? There's this family and that family, but we don't call ourselves the mafia. We don't have a hierarchy. We have individual groups underneath that have a hierarchy, but the idea that there is a hierarchy ahead of the mafia, no, that doesn't exist. They don't call themselves. Similar to Antifa, right? Exact same analogy, right? Sure, Antifa is a broad umbrella for a bunch of groups that identify as Antifa that are engaging in acts of political terrorism. But the hierarchy is the individual groups they have, like Rose City Antifa, John Brown Gun Club, etc., that are Antifa organizations. Much like the Gambino crime family is a mafioso organization. That doesn't mean that they don't exist or that we shouldn't use RICO statutes to go after them, because technically there's no organization called the mafia. It's just a label applied to all of these Italian crime families.
Sure, but like applying that same logic, would you want to uh, categorize gangs and the mafia and shit as terrorist organizations?
Sure, if they're engaged in political terrorism. So, for example, if the mafia had been bombing, Kennedy and Democrats and constantly attacking Democrat institutions and attacking the FBI and shit, sure, those are would you not? If the mafia attacked, put a bomb outside the DNC, would you call that an act of political terrorism?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have a problem with calling them terrorists?
Well, the problem that it comes down to is like when we're talking about domestic terrorism is like, what do we define as domestic terrorism? Because like we don't, even though a lot of school shooters and a lot of mass shooters have political agendas and do shit on political agendas, we don't hit those people with terrorism charges. Like the guy who went around and murdered the multiple political officials in Minnesota, that dude didn't get hit with terrorism charges, but that was an act of terrorism.
But again, you could qualify that. You could say that it's selectively applied and we don't always apply it. That guy's getting his just desserts, regardless of whether or not it's called a terrorism charge or not. What we would call domestic terrorism would be non-state actors using violence or intimidation to achieve political or cultural needs, right? I think that when we look at an individual, so if you, let's say you've never even talked politics online and you're just some dude and you're like, I get it in my head that some dog told me to take out, Joe Schmo, my senator. I don't think we would call that domestic terrorism, even though the goal was to take out a political person. However, what we're looking at with these organizations, like Antifa organizations, they're actually using violence and intimidation to try to affect political change because there are certain laws or certain politicians that they don't like. If that doesn't fall under the umbrella of political terrorism, I don't know what ever would. What's the point of even having the term? Now, if your argument is, much like hate speech, there should never be any enforcement of, if there's a crime, there's a crime, but we should never use the umbrella of political terrorism.
My point is kind of like terrorism is subjective. Like we could talk about certain things that like the fucking Proud Boys have done that could be considered terrorism. Like
many groups did try to call them terrorists. There was an attempt to classify them as a terrorist group. The point is, I think that you make a solid point that sometimes when we allow words like this to be applied, they could be overused. And it's certainly something worth questioning. But the problem is, whatever you want to call it, there needs to be some mechanism to go after these organized, violent left-wing groups that have been acting in many of these cities like Portland with immunity for a decade. They sequestered 6 city blocks in Seattle and called it the Chaz Zone. They murdered a 15-year-old African-American boy. There were multiple accusations in the Chaz Zone of women being SA'd. And the local police stood down. They took them food. Warlords running a section of this country, that's unthinkable. And yet, we're told that we're monsters for saying this shit can't stand. Our FBI stood back and were like, while they went after blue-haired grandmas on January 6th, like they were ISIS. So the idea that we have to sit back and watch these organized, violent, militant left-wing groups that are getting funding from somewhere operate with impunity and say, no, there's no cohesion there, there's no organization, is absolute bullshit. And even though the civil libertarian in me wants to say, well, we have to be careful before we allow a president to send the National Guard or to designate domestic organizations as terrorists, what's the alternative at this point? It's clear that the left is more than happy to have these brown shirts on the ground intimidating and using violence against their opponents. So something must be done. It would never fly the other way. Name me one time where you can imagine a red city, right, that didn't like federal law enforcement, that was allowing their people over and over and over and over, right-wingers, to attack federal law enforcement. You can't do it. The best you'd be able to come is talking about racial groups like the Klan way back in the day. Those were Democrats anyways. But even to the extent we would say that, is that really how far back we're going? I think it's abhorrent.
No,
I
mean,
wish that we didn't have left-wingers that were doing these attacks. I wish that the Democrats would step up and say, this shit's unacceptable. What are the Democrats doing instead? There's no violence, just like they did in Black Lives Matter. Mostly peaceful. What are you talking about? Violence is the language of the unheard. And by the way, we need to get these masks off ICE people. Today I saw Democrats in California announcing that they're creating a program that's going to be a tracker app so that you can track where ICE is. This is while ICE agents are being attacked on a daily basis. 1 month ago, a radical lefty took shots at ICE agents in an ICE facility and killed 2 detainees. And yet the Democrats still go, we don't see a problem. What are you talking about? So, no, I'm sorry. The time has come and gone. We have to aggressively go after these left-wing groups. I think they're terrorist groups. The word doesn't matter. And if designating them as terrorists means that we can make this country a safer place to get out of this political violence and intimidation, more power to it. I only hope when they find the funding and the connections that it leads to high-powered people that face the consequences of their actions, much like we would go after people that fund groups such as ISIS or the mafia. That's my hope.
I mean, if we want to look at organized right-wing groups going after, or not necessarily going after, but attacking cops, we don't need to go back all the way that far. We just have to look back to 2020 with January 6th.
What about it? Did they go after those people?
No, but they did attack cops on January 6th.
Sure. And? It was the largest FBI task force in history. Right? The people were placed in solitary confinement. They were treated like dog shit, even people that were nonviolent. Meanwhile, precipitating that was month after month after month of violent left-wingers getting slaps on the wrist. All the while, people like me were shouting from the heavens, like, once you allow political violence to be done with basically no consequences whatsoever, inevitably the other side will play the game. If I asked you to name right-wing riots, right-wing political riots, how many could you name?
The only one that I can think of off the top of my head is January 6th.
Let me give you another, Charlottesville.
I mean, that didn't really, well, no, that did turn violent, you're right.
It did, and there were 2 sides to it, but I'll even give you that one. Okay, that's 2. You want me to name left-wing ones? You want me to start? How long do you have? Portland, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, day 8, and on and on. Stanford did a review that was used by the left to say that Black Lives Matter rallies were mostly peaceful. It said that there were only 7% of the locations of the rally that were violent. That came down to 212 locations of violence. Now, here's the problem with that. Seattle only counts as 1 location, even though there were probably 30 or 40 riots that occurred there. Same with Portland. Same with Atlanta. That's how ubiquitous violence is on the left. It happens constantly, and we just accept it. That's the problem.
The thing is, when we talk about left-wing violence versus right-wing violence, yes, left-wing violence does tend to happen in bigger groups through riots and stuff like that. I'm not going to deny that.
Good.
But when we talk about right-wing violence, typically speaking, there are more deaths involved, because when we talk about right-wing violence, we're talking about mass shooters. We're talking about, well, mostly mass shooters, like the guy who shot up the fucking gay bar in fucking Dayton, Ohio.
Was that what? Now be careful. Be careful. Is that right-wing?
I'm pretty sure that
most people would
right-wing.
categorize that as Islamic.
I would categorize far-right Islam as right-wing, so.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, even though Democrats by far more support Islam, you would still characterize it as right-wing?
Yes.
Let me ask you this. Most of these studies also include white supremacist violence as right-wing. You agree?
Yes.
What about black supremacist? Left-wing?
I would consider that left-wing.
Why?
Yes.
Isn't it racial violence? Isn't that a right-wing thing?
Not necessarily.
That's the same reason that I would say that we separate Islamic terrorism from right-wing terrorism. Although you may define religious extremism as right-wing, and it would depend on how we define right or left. But even if we accept that, we could see that these people identify more as the party of the Democrats than the party of the Republicans. So the moniker of left-right would really then not be as important as saying, well, okay, violence inspired by people that tend to vote Republican versus tend to vote Democrat.
I mean, the Dayton, Ohio one could have been a bad example, but I mean, we still got the guy I already brought up in Minnesota. We've got fucking tens of mass shooters that have been white supremacists. We've got,
but there's a lot of shooters. Like, again, if we accept black supremacy, look, think of this, right? Already when we talked about hate speech, we illustrated this problem. Now let's look at hate crimes. Same problem. Who gets to define it? Blacks, according to the most recent data that I looked at from the FBI, are anywhere from 23 times to 27 times more likely to commit homicide against a white person than vice versa. And yet we almost never say that that's an example of black violence or black political violence. We just say, ho-hum, when they do it. Go ahead.
There is a distinct difference in those versus when we're talking about mass shooters committing violence. Specifically white supremacist mass shooters, because white supremacist mass shooters usually have manifestos saying, there are quite a few examples.
Is it usually? I don't know if that's true. But look, I can tell you, I just talked to a woman named BX yesterday that talks a lot about this. For example, there was a alleged white supremacist shooter in Texas at a grocery store some years ago. He said in his manifesto that he was inspired by the Christchurch shooter. Now, the Christchurch shooter was clearly not a right-winger. He was clearly an accelerationist, because what he included in his manifesto was, yes, I'm shooting up brown people because I dislike them. Okay, you might say white supremacist. Checkmate, right? However, he also said he was shooting people because of climate change. Now, is that a left or a right-wing cause? Then he said he was shooting people because of the game Spyro the Dragon. Now, is that a left or a right-wing cause? Now, it's clear that this person was much like the Joker. He just wants to see the world burn. So I'll just throw shit against the wall. And guess what? When I'm gone, the left's going to say he was a righty and the right's going to say he was a lefty. Now we have this dude in Texas that says, yes, I'm doing the same thing. Yet we consider that right-wing violence. Who controls the data? Who gets to determine what's left-wing and right-wing? Like, the problem is that we just had this horrible, horrible murder of this young woman from Ukraine on a train. Her name was Irina. Did you see that?
I heard about that, yeah.
Is that left-wing violence?
I heard about it. I didn't really look into it.
He said, I got a white girl after he killed her. Now, I'll guarantee that the studies that you look at and say, oh, right-wing violence is worse, ain't going to include that under left-wing violence. It's going to say, well, no, he was sick in the head. And, he had other things going on. How many times have we seen examples where we see obvious racial motivations from people of color against white people, and yet we jump through hoops to say there's other explanations. And yet if a white person, kills a black person, the default assumption is racism? Even though the data is inverted of that blacks are far more likely to kill a white than vice versa.
So racial violence isn't always political. It can be political, but it's not always political. So if I don't think that if the fucking what are they? The Muslim Brotherhood fucking killed people because of politics, which I don't think they ever actually did, at least here in America. That would be both racial violence and political violence, because has a political motive.
Well, wait, you don't know that. What if they killed people because it was a drug deal gone bad? Is that still political violence?
No, if it's a drug deal gone bad,
that matters, because violence. A lot of these studies that you look at, it'll include things like this. A white racist gang shot up people in a meth deal. That's political violence. That's right-wing violence. But is it really? It's a drug deal gone bad. Sure, they're shitheads, but they would never do the same. They would never, if the Crips shoot up someone over a drug deal, they call that left-wing violence.
If the Aryan Brotherhood shot up some dudes in a fucking meth deal, no, I wouldn't consider that political violence.
But they do. Obviously. Those studies do. It's crazy. They consider a lot of the political violence that they talk about is literally in prison. It's white supremacist gangs in prison, but they don't consider the Hispanic gangs or the black gangs. They don't consider that left-wing violence. That doesn't factor in. The studies are outlandish that say this, and I think that you're just mistaken anyways.
I'd have to find it. I'd have to find it again. But the one that I'm specifically like mentally referring to is one that was specifically looking at mass shootings.
I just don't define mass shooting.
So when I'm talking about mass shootings, I'm talking about people like the Vegas shooter, which obviously that one wasn't political.
No.
But school shootings.
You're saying what they're like, but a mass shooting normally is defined as what, 3 or more shots, something like that?
Not necessarily, because not all shootings have all like school shootings. Not all of them are considered mass shootings, but not all of them have 3 or more people killed.
I don't know if that's true. Nonetheless, however you would define it, then I guess a single shot, even if it's as a school, doesn't qualify as a mass shooting, right?
If there is a single person killed and then multiple injured, it does.
Okay,
it is considered a mass shooting.
Okay, so it would have to be more than 2, I think, in order for it to be considered a mass shooting. Whatever, it's 2 or 3. It can't just be one. We agree with that.
Like,
what race of people do you think commit the majority of mass shootings?
White people.
Not even close. It's black people. Not even close. Not even close. Most of them are gangland shootings. If the definition is just more than 2 people hit, I mean, my goodness. It's not even close. You just never hear about it. That's it.
Inner gang violence isn't necessarily a mass shooting. That's
No, I disagree. That you might say it's not political motivation. That's a fair argument. But why would we disqualify that as a mass shooting?
Because a lot of the time when we're talking about inter gang conflicts, both sides are shooting at each other.
Still a mass shooting. No, by definition. And I don't think that's how it goes.
When we're talking about mass shootings, there's usually it usually is qualified under like the serial killer method of like 1 to like 2, maybe a group of people, but groups of people are extremely rare. It's usually like 1 to 2 people that commit mass shootings.
I don't understand. I don't think that the majority just to be quite clear, I don't think the majority of what you're speaking here, at least it would be enough to lower the blacks would no longer be number one, is that gangs are shooting at each other. Most of the time, this way this works is like drive-bys and shit. In fact, the like sort of westernized, romanticized, like, you know, gunslingers in the Wild West, and that gangs are like that too. And it's, you know, they're hiding behind cars and shooting at each other is probably very rare. Most of the time, it's like someone shoots unsuspecting people in a gang, and then their ops get them back later, and they shoot them when they're unsuspecting. There's not a lot of examples of like two gangs lining up side by side and duking it out. I don't think that's true. And nonetheless, we're running afoul of the original point, and I do have to go to the restroom soon. But I think that the point I'm trying to make is the data that you're looking at is horribly skewed. Horribly. The truth is, when it comes to examples of political violence, the left overwhelmingly commits more. And we all know it. There was a reason that businesses boarded up their business in 2020 during the election. And it wasn't because they were afraid that Donald Trump was going to lose. It was they were afraid that he was going to win, and once more the left would riot, like they always do. And they're doing it again. We know this occurs, right? The idea that some lunatic extremist goes out and shoots a bunch of people and identifies as right wing, yeah, fuck that guy. But the problem with the Democratic Party is not that it's some fringe extremist. It's that we see these people engaging in the open in violence over and over again, and then so many people in the Democratic Party seemingly are okay with it. That's why we saw tens of thousands of people proudly take to social media to say Charlie Kirk deserved to die. Why is it that someone that said heinous shit, like Destiny, far more heinous shit than Charlie Kirk ever said, could go to college campuses as much as Charlie Kirk did, and instead of having buff dudes as his security and worried about getting shot in the neck, he has not so erudite as his security? We all know the truth. We know. We know. I have a friend. When I ran for Congress, my campaign manager, who I'm actually meeting for lunch tomorrow, great dude, he's a Democrat, right? I asked him this one time. I said, are you ever worried that someone will enact violence because of your politics? He said, not a chance. I said, how about me? He's like, yeah. He knows. You know it too. You absolutely know it. All of us right here know it, and everyone watching, if they're honest, knows it too. That it's acceptable to use violence and intimidation against right-wingers because we're fascist, because we're evil, we're racist, we're thisism, we're thatism. That's the truth. We know that the left engages in more of this. That doesn't mean that you can't slice the data in some weird way and say, but if we limit it to mass shootings that occur at churches, then perhaps the right's worse. Maybe not. But there's going to be fringe assholes that carry out mass shootings all over the place. And fuck them. And yes, if you could draw a direct connection to a political ideology, it's worth critiquing that, absolutely. But it's not as commonplace as we see with violence not only occurring on the left, out in the open, but also being celebrated or ignored by prominent people in the left. And yet, our law enforcement treats them with the exact inversion of that. Right-wing violence is treated as the worst thing that ever happened, and the director of the FBI, Chris Wray, says Antifa's just an idea. It's absolutely incredible. And so, no, I do not accept your framing that Donald Trump's trying to make it illegal to criticize capitalism. I think there are valid reasons for Donald Trump to be aggressive in going after left-wing terrorists. And I think the American people are tired of this shit. They saw the Summer of Love. They saw the gaslighting. They saw the fires as places like CNN proudly took to the cameras and said, it's mostly peaceful as fires rage behind. They watched that shit happen and they saw almost no consequences. In fact, many of those rioters were later rewarded as they filed lawsuits against the city. They saw the left lose their fucking mind over January 6th and still to this day talk about it as a seminal day, as if it was Pearl Harbor, and then right back to the riots as soon as their side loses. And we're fucking tired of it. That's the truth. And that's why Democrats can't get any momentum when it comes to these sorts of issues. If Democrats instead decided to stop being psychopaths and arguing that Donald Trump was doing things that economically might not be good or might not be good for foreign policy, they'd probably be much more popular than they are now. But they can't help themselves. They appeal to the most radical because those radical people benefited them in the past.